I didn't tell anyone where I went that night, not because I wanted to disappear, but because I needed to fall apart somewhere no one would ask me why. And I thought if I made myself small enough, quiet enough, far enough, I could collapse without being seen. Without explaining the weight I'd carried all week like a second skin. And I chose the old bridge out by the edge of town not because it meant anything, but because it didn't. Because it was silent and unbothered and wide enough to hold everything I hadn't said. And I sat on the cold concrete with my arms around my knees, feeling the chill rise through my sleeves and into my bones. And I don't know how long I stayed like that. Not moving, not crying, just unraveling until I heard footsteps on the gravel behind me, and I froze, hoping they'd pass, hoping I wouldn't have to become a person again just yet. But the steps slowed, and something in me braced for the worst until I heard your voice, soft, calm, familiar, say my name, like it was a question and a whisper all at once. And I turned around, stunned, because I hadn't told you I was leaving, hadn't messaged, hadn't dropped a single clue. And yet there you were, standing in the soft dark like a steady lighthouse in a storm I hadn't admitted I was drowning in. And you didn't ask what I was doing, or why I looked like I hadn't slept in days. You just took off your coat and sat down beside me like we'd planned it. Like this wasn't strange or hard or heavy, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. Because I hadn't known until right then how badly I'd needed someone to show up without asking, without requiring a script or a reason or a neat explanation. And you didn't speak again for a long time. Just sat there, close, but not too close. Your shoulder brushing mine like punctuation at the end of a sentence I didn't have the words for. And slowly, gently, the silence between us softened, came less of a burden and more of a blanket. And I realized you weren't here to fix anything or rescue me. You were here to witness it, to be the presence that made the breaking less lonely. And I think that's what undid me most, not the comfort, but the permission, the quiet reminder that I didn't have to earn your care or justify my sadness, that you would sit with me in the in-between, the nowhere, the not quite anything, and still choose to stay. And when I finally spoke, 'twas only one word, "Wand." You just looked at me and said, because I felt you pull away, and somehow that made more sense than anything else, because friendship like ours isn't built on logic or schedule or even words. It's built on intuition, on knowing when to knock, even when the door's been closed too long, on showing up not for answers, but for presence. And I don't remember everything we said after that, or how long we stayed, but I remember the way the stars looked above us, quiet and distant and watching, and the way your breath misted the air as you laughed softly at something I said, and the way I felt lighter, not fixed, not healed, just less alone, and that was enough. That was everything. I don't think I ever told you how much that morning meant to me, the one where everything in me felt too heavy to carry and too loud to explain, and I had done what I always did when it got bad, turned off my phone, drew the curtains, laid in bed with the kind of stillness that wasn't rest but retreat. And I thought if I waited long enough, the noise in my chest would quiet down on its own. But hours passed, and all I had managed to do was blink at the same patch of ceiling and wonder how much of me would be left when I finally stood up again. And I didn't expect anyone to notice, didn't expect anyone to care, because I'd gotten good at disappearing quietly, at vanishing beneath politeness and the illusion of being okay. But somehow you did. Somehow you noticed the shift, the silence, the subtle absence in the spaces where my voice usually lived. And even though I hadn't answered any of your messages, even though I hadn't sent my usual good morning ramble or a voice note about nothing, you still showed up, quietly, without demand, without expectation. And when I heard the soft knock on my door that afternoon, I almost didn't answer. Not because I didn't want to see you, but because I didn't know if I could see anyone without breaking. But something in your knock wasn't loud or urgent, was patient. It was kind, it was safe, and when I finally opened the door, wrapped in the same hoodie I'd worn for 3 days, my hair a mess and my eyes tired, you didn't flinch, didn't comment, didn't try to make it better. You just smiled, that soft, knowing smile that always felt like breath, and held up a small paper bag with pastries and my favorite drink and said, "Thought you might need a quiet day." And I nodded, not trusting my voice, and stepped aside to let you in. And for the next few hours, we didn't do much at all, just sat on the floor with music playing low and the rain tapping softly on the windows. And every time I looked over at you, you weren't staring or waiting or pressing, you were just there, thumbing through a book or sipping your drink or quietly existing beside me in the most sacred way. And I think that's when it hit. Real friendship isn't just about showing up when someone asks. It's about showing up when they can't. When the words won't form, when the lights are off and the silence is thick. And instead of demanding entry, you sit outside the door until they feel safe enough to open it. And you had done that for me, again and again, without keeping score, without asking for anything in return. And it wasn't grand or dramatic, but it was real, it was rare. And when the sun finally started to set and I rested my head against your shoulder without needing permission, felt something shift inside me, not everything, not a miracle. Just a small, soft truth growing in the quiet space between us, that even in my lowest, messiest, most unspoken places, you would still come find me. It was a Thursday when everything in me felt like it was unraveling from the inside out, not because of one single thing, but because of everything, the way small hurts pile on top of each other, until suddenly even standing feels like a negotiation. And I hadn't meant to let it show, hadn't meant to let it slip into my voice or my eyes, or the way I lingered too long in the hallway before saying goodbye. But somehow you knew, somehow you saw past the soft smile and the half-hearted "I'm fine." And when I turned around to leave, your hand gently caught my sleeve, not pulling, just holding, just enough pressure to say, "I see you." And for a moment I stood there, frozen in the strange tenderness of it, because so few people had ever stopped me when I said I was okay. So few had ever listened to the things I didn't say out loud. And when I looked at you, I saw the question sitting gently in your eyes, the kind that didn't need an answer, the kind that was willing to wait, and I wanted to tell you everything right then. Wanted to let the words pour out like rain, but all I could manage was a breath, shallow and stuck in my chest, and you didn't push, didn't ask again. You just nodded and said, "Come with me." And maybe it was the quiet way you said it or the steadiness in your presence, but I followed without thinking, without asking where. And you drove in silence, the kind that didn't need filling, the kind that wrapped itself around both of us like a shared understanding, and we ended up at that old lake, the one with the rickety dock and the broken bench we used to sit on when the world felt too loud. And I don't know how long we stayed there, just watching the ripples move like slow thoughts, your shoulder brushing mine every now and then like a soft reminder that I wasn't alone. And eventually, in the safety of that stillness, the words started to come, not in a rush, not in a perfect order, but in pieces, in sighs, in broken confessions. And you listened the way only you ever have, with your whole body, your whole silence, never interrupting, never offering solutions, just letting me pour out everything I had been afraid to name. And when I finally stopped talking, the sky had turned a soft lavender, and my voice was raw from trying to explain what I didn't fully understand. And you didn't say anything profound or poetic. You just looked at me with that same quiet knowing and said, "You don't have to carry this alone anymore." And I think I believed you, not because you said it, but because you lived it. Because time and time again you had shown up without needing an invitation, without needing to be needed. And that kind of love, the kind that doesn't knock, but simply waits beside the door until you're ready. That kind of love changes you. Not all at once, but slowly, like sunlight seeping into places that have long been dark. And as we drove back under a sky full of early stars, I didn't feel fixed, but I did feel lighter, and maybe that was enough. I don't remember the exact day you became my safe place. Only that one moment I was still bracing for the next time someone left, and the next you were just there. Steady and soft, like the quiet that comes after rain, and it wasn't loud or dramatic or marked with confessions. It was gradual. Like warmth returning to fingers gone cold, like breath finding its rhythm again. And I think that's why it took me a while to notice just how much of me had started to trust you. Because trust doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it sneaks in slowly through laughter and inside jokes and the way your presence never asked me to be anything but exactly who I was. And there was something holy about that afternoon we spent doing nothing. Just sitting on the floor of your room, surrounded by pillows and the remnants of snacks we didn't finish, a playlist humming softly in the background like it was breathing with us. And you had your eyes closed, face turned toward the light filtering through the window. And I remember thinking, this is what safety feels like. Not because anything profound was happening, but because for the first time in weeks, I wasn't performing, wasn't shrinking, wasn't holding my breath waiting to be too much, and you didn't need me to be cheerful or interesting or useful. You just let me be. And when I told you I was tired, not just sleepy, but soul tired, the kind of tired that comes from holding yourself together too tightly for too long, you didn't rush in with solutions or pep talks. You just nodded like you understood, like you'd carried that same kind of tired in your own bones once too. And you passed me a blanket without saying a word, not because I asked, but because you noticed. And I think that was the moment I realized. The depth of what you were offering me wasn't loud or obvious, it was quiet care. The kind that listens between the lines and shows up without needing a reason, and I felt it again later. When I drifted off for a few minutes and woke up to find you sitting nearby still, scrolling through your phone but staying close, like some part of you knew I needed to wake up and not be alone. And when I blinked and whispered thank you, you just smiled and said, always, like it wasn't even a question. And maybe that's the thing that undoes me the most, how you keep showing up without keeping score. How you make space for my silences like they're part of the conversation. How you treat my messiness like it's not something to fix, but something to sit beside. And every time I try to explain it to someone else, I find myself short on words. Because how do you describe a love that lives in the in-between moments? In the quiet glances and remembered preferences and soft laughs at midnight. In the way you remember which side of the bed I prefer, or how I take my tea, or the fact that I need to touch walls when I'm anxious. And maybe I don't need to explain it. Maybe the way I breathe easier when you're near is all the explanation I'll ever need, because not once, not ever have you made me feel like I needed to be more or less than who I am. And that's something I'll spend the rest of my life trying to give back to you. It started with the kind of morning that already felt like too much before I even opened my eyes. The kind where even the light slipping through the blinds felt sharp. Where the weight in my chest didn't have a name, but pressed down with the same quiet ache it always did. When the world began to feel far away and too close all at once. And I almost canceled on you. Almost sent the message that said, maybe another time, or not feeling well today. But something in me remembered the way you never asked for perfection. Never expected me to arrive with my joy fully charged. And so I went, hesitant and heavy. Unsure of how much of myself I'd be able to give, but knowing, deep down, that you wouldn't ask for more than I could offer. And when I got to your door and you opened it with that soft smile that didn't try too hard or reach too far, I knew I had made the right decision, because you didn't comment on the bags under my eyes or the way I kept fidgeting with my sleeves. You just stepped aside, let me in, and return to the blanket nest you'd made on the floor like it had been waiting for both of us all along. And I don't remember what we watched or what we ate or what we said that day, only that I never once felt like I had to explain my quiet, never once felt like I needed to fill the air with words just to prove I was okay. And maybe that's what you do better than anyone else. You hold space, not the kind that demands answers or forces healing, but the kind that whispers, "You're allowed to be exactly how you are right now." And sometimes I still think about the moment I rested my head on your shoulder and let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, and how you didn't shift or stiffen or make it a thing. You just kept sitting there, letting me lean, letting me exist without commentary or expectation. And it's strange how much that meant, how much that still means, because it wasn't about fixing anything. It was about being with me in the middle of it, about showing up even when I didn't send an invitation. And I think that's the kind of friendship that stays with you, the kind that softens the memory of all the times you were too much for someone else, the kind that stitches new stories into old wounds, the kind that sits quietly beside the ache until it becomes something you can carry. And maybe that's why I keep coming back to you, not because you always know what to say, but because you never make me feel like I need to say anything at all unless I want to. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's everything. Maybe that's the reason I've never felt more at home with anyone than I do when I'm next to you, breathing the same quiet air, healing without having to announce it. I think what stays with me most isn't any single moment or grand gesture, but all the small, almost invisible ways you stayed. The times when nothing was said, but everything was felt, the way you seemed to sense the cracks before they split open, the way your presence never felt like pressure, but like breath, like air when I was drowning in silence. And I remember one night in particular, when the hours felt stretched thin and brittle, and I couldn't sleep, couldn't settle the noise in my mind. So I sat in the hallway with my back against the wall and my knees tucked to my chest, phone in my hand but no words to type, and somehow you knew. Somehow, without any message or signal, you called, not with a question or a demand, but just your voice, quiet and steady, saying, "Hey," like you had been meaning to all along. And I didn't say much, just breathed and listened. And you didn't fill the silence with advice or distractions. You just stayed on the line while I said almost nothing at all, and it was in that almost nothing that I felt everything, every unspoken promise, every time you'd shown up before I even knew how to ask. Every way you'd told me I didn't have to be loud or whole or ready to deserve love. And after a while you said, "I can come over if you want." And I hesitated, not because I didn't want you there, but because I didn't know how to receive that kind of care without folding into pieces. And somehow you must have heard that hesitation, must have read it like you always do, because you added, "Or I can just stay here with you like this." And I realized that's what made you different. You never pushed past my comfort. You never tried to force closeness where I needed space. You just let me choose. And no matter what I chose, you stayed. And that night, I didn't ask you to come over, but we stayed on the phone until the sky began to lighten. And even though we barely spoke, even though hours passed in near silence, I fell asleep with the phone still against my ear, heart quieter than it had been in days. And when I woke up to your message that simply read, "I'm proud of you for making it through the night," I didn't cry, not because it didn't matter, but because it mattered so much I didn't have the language for it, And it made me think about all the ways we show up for the people we love, not always with noise or rescue or answers, but with patience, with presence, with the quiet belief that just being there can sometimes be the most healing thing in the world. And maybe that's the kind of friend you are, the kind who doesn't knock, doesn't wait to be invited, but notices the flicker in someone's voice and moves toward it. The kind who doesn't leave when the room goes dim, who doesn't run from silence, Who doesn't need a version of me that's shinier or easier to carry? And even now, after all this time, I still think of that night as one of the purest acts of love I've ever received. No spotlight, no stage, just one soul saying to another, "I'm not going anywhere," and meaning it. It wasn't the kind of day that anyone else would have noticed, not the kind of heavy that shouts or stumbles, just a slow kind of ache. The kind that wears you down in places no one sees, and I almost convinced myself it wasn't worth mentioning. That I should just push through, smile through, carry it quietly like I always had, but you showed up anyway. Not because I asked or hinted or gave you any clue at all, but because you somehow knew, the way you always do. And you knocked like you weren't sure if I'd answer, but like you were ready to wait. And when I opened the door, still in the clothes I'd slept in, still with the weight sitting just beneath my eyes. You didn't ask what was wrong, didn't tilt your head or lace your voice with concern. You just lifted the bag you were holding and said, "I brought soup," like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. And maybe that's what I needed. Not a grand gesture, not a fix, just someone who didn't flinch at my silence. Someone who saw the small cracks and responded with kindness so quiet it almost didn't feel like care until I realized I was breathing easier and we sat at the kitchen table without turning on the lights. Just the soft afternoon gloom holding us like a lullaby. And I stirred the soup slowly while you told me about something funny you'd seen that morning, not because it was important, but because it was gentle, and I didn't say much at first. Just nodded and listened, and let your voice carry me. And when I finally looked up and met your eyes, you didn't lean in or try to pull anything out of me. You just held the moment like it was enough. Like this quiet, this togetherness was already healing something. And I think it was. Because there's a kind of comfort that doesn't announce itself. It just seeps in slowly, sits beside your pain, and doesn't ask it to leave. And you did that without even realizing, without needing a name for what I was feeling or a story to wrap around it. And I realized, in that still kitchen with the rain starting to tap gently against the windows, that this is the kind of friendship people don't write about enough. The kind that doesn't need explanation or performance. The kind that holds space not with grand speeches, but with presence. With timing, with knowing that sometimes soup and silence are more than enough. And I don't know when exactly you learned how to read me like this. How to hear the things I don't say. But every time you show up like that, without needing an invitation, without needing to be needed, I feel something inside me soften. Something that once believed love had to be earned with brightness and noise and certainty. And now I'm starting to believe in something gentler. Something more enduring. Something like this. Like you. Like a friend who brings soup on the days you can't find your voice and never once asks you to explain why. The night the lights went out, I told myself I'd be fine, that it was just a small thing. Just a storm and a power cut and a little extra quiet. But somehow the darkness felt heavier than usual. Like it wasn't just the lamps and the ceiling lights that went out, but something in me too. Something that had already been flickering for a while and finally gave up. When the sky turned black and the only sound left was the creaking of old walls and the way my thoughts got louder in the silence. And I was sitting on the floor with a single candle flickering on the windowsill when I heard a knock, soft and unassuming, like the night had sent it rather than a person. And when I opened the door, there you were hooed up, flashlight in one hand, a bag in the other, and you just smiled like it wasn't strange at all to show up without calling. Like this was just what you did when the world went dark. And you said, figured you'd need company. And that was it. No big explanation. No overreaching care, just presence, just quiet knowing. And I let you in without thinking twice because your face felt like warmth and safety and home. And we lit more candles and sat in that soft golden glow that made the room feel older, quieter, almost sacred. And I remember how you pulled out a deck of cards and asked if I wanted to play something. and how we ended up telling stories instead. The kind you only share when everything else has fallen still. The kind you don't tell in daylight or in text. And I found myself saying things I hadn't planned to say. Small truths and tangled memories that didn't need answers. And you just listened with your eyes soft and your shoulders relaxed, and not once did you interrupt. Not once did you rush the moment. And I think that's what I'll remember most. Not the candlelight or the storm or the way the cards scattered across the floor, but the way your presence steadied me without trying to. The way you didn't panic when I said I felt like I was losing myself, like parts of me had gone dim and I didn't know how to get them back, and you just reached for another candle, lit it slowly, and said, "We'll sit in the dark as long as you need." And I could have cried, not because of sadness, but because of how deeply seen I felt. How rare it was to be met exactly where I was without being pulled or pushed or questioned. And maybe that's what friendship really is, sitting in the dark, with someone who doesn't try to drag you into the light. Someone who stays until your eyes adjust and your breath evens out and you remember how to hold your own hand again. And as the night stretched on and the storm softened and the silence between us turned from hollow to whole, I realized I wasn't afraid of the dark anymore, not when you were there. Not when I knew you'd keep showing up, invitation or not. I hadn't told you about the appointment. About the way my hands wouldn't stop shaking while I sat in the sterile waiting room with its 2 white walls and 2 loud silence. About the moment I almost walked out before they called my name. About how I couldn't remember what I said when they asked what brought me in, because everything felt like too much and nothing all at once. And I didn't think I'd need anyone there, didn't want to make it a thing. Didn't want to explain why I was scared of something so small on paper, but so loud in my chest. So I kept it to myself like I always had, thinking it would be easier that way. But when I stepped out of the building, drained and quiet and holding the kind of ache that doesn't show on your face, I looked up and there you were, standing by the curb with that familiar calm in your shoulders and a warmth in your eyes that felt like gravity, like relief, and I stared for a second too long before walking over and whispering, "How did you know?" And you shrugged like it was nothing and said, "You were quieter than usual," like that was all the clue you needed. Like you had learned to read the pauses between my words and the spaces between my breaths. And you didn't ask what happened or if I was okay. You just opened the car door and handed me a water bottle and said, "Let's go somewhere soft." And I don't know if you meant the place or the moment, or just the feeling of not having to be strong for a while. But whatever it was, it worked. Because by the time we got to the little overlook by the cliffs, with the wind moving through the trees like an old song and the sky folding into dusk, I could feel the tightness in my chest beginning to loosen. And we sat in the grass with our backs against the old fence, the horizon open and wide and forgiving. And for a long time, neither of us said anything, and I think that silence saved me more than any words could have, because you weren't there to fix it or label it or rush me through it. You were just there, like you always are, like the steady echo of a heartbeat beside my own. And eventually, I told you everything, not because I planned to, but because your presence felt like a doorway I didn't have to force open. And you didn't flinch when I said the things I was ashamed to say out loud. You just nodded like you'd already made space for all of it. And when I was done, when my voice cracked and my throat burned from trying to hold it all in for too long, you looked out at the ocean and said, "It doesn't make you weak to be scared," and I know you meant more than that. I know what you were really saying was you're still loved even in this. And maybe that's what makes you different, how you remind me again and again that love doesn't withdraw when things get messy. That real friendship doesn't need a performance or a plan, just presence, just quiet loyalty, just the kind of care that shows up at the curb without being asked and says, "You don't have to do this alone," And I think if there's one thing I'll carry forever, it's the memory of how that moment felt, not fixed, not perfect, but held gently, completely, by someone who never needed an invitation to care. There's something I never told you about that day, something small? Maybe, but it stayed with me in the soft corners of memory, growing brighter over time like a match lit in the middle of winter. And it's this: I was already halfway gone when you arrived, not physically, not dramatically, but emotionally. Like I'd started fading from myself without meaning to. Like the exhaustion had crept in too slowly for me to notice until I couldn't feel much of anything anymore. And I remember sitting in my car for almost an hour, keys still in the ignition, staring through the windshield like the world on the other side didn't quite belong to me. And I don't know what I was waiting for. Maybe a sign. Maybe a reason to get out and go home. Maybe nothing at all, but then my phone lit up and there was your name. Not with a question, not with a demand, just 2 words. I'm outside, and at first I didn't move because I didn't believe it. Didn't believe someone would just know without being told, without being begged, without being given a map of the ache I couldn't explain. But when I looked up and saw you leaning against the passenger door of your car, arms folded loosely and eyes scanning the parking lot like you were searching for something quiet and lost, I broke. Not all at once, but in the way a dam breaks slowly under pressure that's been building too long. And I got out and walked to you, and you didn't say anything? Just opened your arms and let me fall into them like gravity had been pulling me toward that moment all along. And I didn't speak for a long time because I didn't have language. Yet for the way you made me feel safe in a world that never stopped asking me to earn it. But you didn't need words. You never did. You just held me and let me be small and silent and seen. And when we finally sat down inside your car, with the air still warm from the sun and the radio playing something soft in the background, you passed me a bottle of water and a small paper bag with snacks I hadn't realized I needed. And you said, "You don't have to explain," and something in me exhaled so deeply I thought I might dissolve into the seat, because how often does someone give you that kind of freedom? The freedom to fall apart without making it about themselves. The freedom to be unreadable and still loved. And we sat there for hours, talking about nothing and everything, letting the day slip by in pieces. And I remember looking at you and thinking that maybe this ordinary store-near, sacred, steady kind of friendship is what I had been looking for all along. Something that doesn't just appear when you're smiling and bright, but stays when you're dim and withdrawn and lost. And even now, after all the noise and motion and moments that came after, I still go back to that day in my mind. Not because it was dramatic or life-altering, but because you were there, fully, quietly, without needing to be asked. And that's what makes you different. That's what makes you unforgettable, not the times you said the right thing, but the way you kept showing up when I had nothing left to offer but silence and presence and tired eyes. And you chose to stay anyway. There was a moment, just a single passing, quiet moment when I realized you had learned every version of me without needing a manual, without needing a breakdown of the storms I had weathered or the blueprints of how I hold myself together on the days when I feel like slipping through the cracks. And it happened on one of those soft Sunday mornings when the world still feels like it's half asleep and the light comes in gentle, filtered, golden. And we were sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by mugs of half-drunk tea and forgotten plans. And you glanced over at me and said, "You're thinking too loud again." And it made me laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was true, because I had been lost in my own head again, wandering through memories I didn't know how to talk about yet, and somehow you knew. Not by the look on my face or anything I had said, but simply because you'd been paying attention to the rhythm of who I was when I wasn't trying to hide. And that's something I still don't know how to thank you for, the way you listened. Even when I wasn't speaking, The way you answered the parts of me I thought were silent. The way you didn't treat my quiet like absence, but like conversation in a language most people don't care to learn. And I remember how we stayed there. For hours, feet tangled in the blanket and a record playing in the background. Not needing to do anything or be anything other than exactly who we were. And I think about that version of you often. The one who looked at my silence and saw a poem instead of a problem. The one who didn't ask me to explain myself to earn your warmth. The one who never once made me feel like I had to be less sensitive, or more together, or easier to understand. And even now, in the middle of a world that spins too fast and demands too much, I carry that stillness with me. The memory of being known like that, of being held not in your arms, but in your awareness. In your quiet decision to stay, and there's something about that kind of love that doesn't need a title or a script. Something holy in how you never once made me feel like I had to perform to be worthy of being kept. And when I look back at my life, when I trace the moments that softened the hardest parts of me, your name is stitched into so many of them. Because you saved me, but because you stood beside me while I saved myself. Because you saw the weight I carried and offered your silence like a second spine, like a gentle kind of strength. And I wonder if you know what a rare kind of grace that is. What a sacred gift it is to be the person someone can fall apart around without fear of being left behind. And I hope I've given that back to you, even just a little. I hope I've sat beside your storms the way you sat beside mine. I hope I've answered your quiet with something soft and safe, because what we have, this quiet, fierce, unshakable friendship, deserves to be mirrored. Not just felt, and I promise, for every time you showed up without needing an invitation, I'll keep leaving the door open for you too. I've come to believe that the most powerful kind of love is the one that doesn't announce itself loudly, doesn't require a dramatic arrival or a well-timed speech, but simply remains quietly, faithfully. Like the chair that's always pulled out beside mine, or the familiar hum of your voice when the world around me goes quiet in a way that feels more hollow than peaceful. And I think of all the days you showed up without warning, not because I asked, not because I gave you some signal, but because something in your heart just knew I needed you. And one of those days is stitched into my memory like a thread that pulled me back to myself, a Tuesday that had started like any other until suddenly I couldn't breathe. Not in the physical sense, but in the way a heart forgets how to stretch when it's been shrinking for too long. And I had tried to push through it, to keep my voice steady, my smile soft, my posture upright. But everything in me was fraying, and just as the silence started to feel unbearable, my phone buzzed and all it said was, "I'm walking your way." And for a second, I didn't know what to do with that, didn't know how to receive something so gentle, so freely given, so perfectly timed. But 20 minutes later, you were sitting across from me at the cafe I hadn't even realized I'd wandered into. And you didn't ask me what was wrong. You didn't lean in with furrowed brows or 1,000 questions. You just sipped your drink and let the space between us be soft and wide enough for me to fall into if I needed to. And eventually, I did. Not with sobs or speeches, but with a slow unraveling. With the kind of vulnerability that arrives when you stop holding yourself together for long enough to let someone else hold you. And the thing is, you didn't catch me with your hands. You caught me with your patience, your quiet, your knowing. And in the hours that followed, you taught me something I never learned from Loud Love You. Taught me that being seen doesn't have to feel like a spotlight. That healing doesn't always need words or plans or solutions. Sometimes it just needs someone to look at you with steady eyes and a heart that doesn't flinch. And now, whenever the noise inside me begins to build, whenever I start to drift into that too familiar space of pretending, I remember that day, that moment. That soft reminder that I never have to perform my pain to be worthy of comfort. And I wonder if you know just how much of me you've restored by simply arriving over and over again without being asked, without asking for anything in return. And maybe this is the kind of friendship that poets spend lifetimes trying to describe and never quite get right, not because it's complicated, but because it's too simple, too pure, too quietly sacred to pin down in perfect metaphors. And even now, after everything, I still catch myself looking at the door, sometimes expecting you to walk in, not out of need or crisis, but because your presence has become something I no longer question, something I simply trust. And in a world that asks us to explain and defend and earn every ounce of love, you are the rare proof that some people arrive because they want to and stay because they mean to, and never once ask for permission to love you exactly where you are. The strange thing about deep friendship is how it rewrites time, how it makes the ordinary days shimmer with a kind of sacred weight, how it turns years into moments and moments into lifelines. And I think about that often when I think about you, about all the days you showed up without knocking, without needing to be asked, without asking me to explain why my eyes were tired or why my voice had gone quiet again. And I don't think I ever told you how much that saved me, not in the dramatic, cinematic sense, but in the quiet, daily way that survival sometimes looks like having someone to sit next to when your thoughts are too loud, or someone who keeps talking while you stare out the window just so you don't feel like you've drifted too far away. And I remember one morning, years after the worst of it, we found ourselves walking the old trail we used to take in college. The one with the overgrown edges and that single broken bench that always leans slightly left. And we didn't talk about anything heavy. Didn't even plan to walk. There, just happened, like so many of our best days did. And I kept thinking how strange it was that something so simple could feel like a heartbeat, like a tether, like evidence that not all things slip away when life gets louder. And at one point, without meaning to, I looked over at you and said, "You know, I think I remember who I was again," and you didn't ask what I meant. Didn't ask who I used to be or who I thought I was now. You just smiled in that quiet way you always do. The one that makes people feel like they've already said enough. And you reached down and picked a rock from the path and handed it to me, and I laughed because of course you did. Because you always had a way of grounding me, literally and otherwise. And now that rock sits on my windowsill, and sometimes when the light hits it just right, I think about all the ways we've walked beside each other through things that don't even have names. All the ways you've stayed when I would have understood if you left. All the ways your loyalty didn't need announcements or milestones, or photos to make it real. And maybe that's why I've never been afraid of the quiet when you're near, because it never feels empty, only still, only full of the kind of love that doesn't shake when it's tested. And maybe that's what makes this friendship different, not the history or the shared references or the countless inside jokes, but the knowing, the deep, wordless knowing that I could lose everything else and still be okay if you were still sitting across from me on some broken bench under a gray sky, not needing to say anything at all because your presence has always been more than enough. And I hope you felt that too. I hope I've been that for you in the quiet spaces of your own life. I hope that all the times I've stayed, all the times I've shown up without waiting to be called, I've reminded you of the same truth you gave to me, that love doesn't always knock. Sometimes it just arrives and sits beside you until you're ready to look up. There's a moment I keep returning to, not because it was grand or dramatic or anything that would be captured in a photo, but because it was still and true and filled with a kind of softness that lives long after it's passed. And in that moment, I looked at you, not the surface of you, not the day's expression or posture, but the whole of you. The person who had shown up over and over again when I was too tired to ask, too quiet to signal, too unsure to believe anyone would stay. And I thought, this is what it means to be held without being handled. And even now, all these years and silences and seasons later, I can still feel the way that moment settled into me like a breath I didn't know I was holding. Because in a world that is so quick to turn away from anything heavy or complex or unexplainable, you kept turning toward me again and again with a presence so steady it softened the sharpest parts of me, and I've spent a long time wondering what that kind of love is made of. How something so invisible can be so tangible. How you could arrive in the middle of a breaking day and sit with me in the ruins without flinching. And I think the answer is this: you never needed me to be okay to stay. Never needed me to smile, to feel welcome. Never needed the chaos to be cleaned up before you were willing to step inside, and there is something unspeakably sacred about that. Something holy in how you never tried to fix me or teach me or save me. You just stayed, and in doing so, you gave me back pieces of myself I didn't know were still reachable. And now, even when we don't speak for a while, even when life takes us in different directions and the calendar fills and the days stretch out, I still feel you with me. In the quietest ways, in the instinct to pause before I spiral. In the softness I now extend to myself because I watched you offer it to me so freely. In the way I've learned to stay beside others without rushing them to heal. And I hope you know that your presence was never wasted. That your patience was never invisible to me. That every time you showed up uninvited, you weren't crossing a boundary, you were offering a lifeline. And I've come to believe that the people who stay without needing reasons are the ones who stitch wholeness back into us just by being who they are. And you did that, not by giving answers, but by giving me the right to be human in front of you without apology. And so if you ever forget your own worth, your own weight, your own irreplaceable place in this world, I hope you remember how your friendship changed the shape of mine. How your loyalty was the first place I ever truly rested. How you were the calm after every storm and the hand I never had to reach for because you were already there. And if you ever wonder what legacy you've left behind in me, it's this: you made me believe that love doesn't have to be loud to be lasting, and that sometimes the most beautiful kind of showing up is the kind that comes without an invitation and stays without an exit.